I still remember the exact tone of his voice, the way it slipped into the room as though it were a casual remark, a phrase dropped with the same indifference as one might mention the weather. He had his cufflinks on, his tie perfectly straightened, and while I sat at the vanity table in our bedroom, brushing through my hair, he glanced at me in the mirror and said, "You wouldn't fit in there." Anur. At first I thought I had misheard him, that perhaps the exhaustion of the day had made me imagine his words. But then he repeated it with that same rehearsed nonchalance, as though he were speaking of something objective and irrefutable, not a dagger pressed gently but firmly into the softest part of my chest. He adjusted his jacket, his eyes lingering on himself rather than on me, and I realized with a cold clarity that this was not just a remark about an evening event, it was his verdict on me as a person. The silence that followed stretched out like a sheet of glass between us. I did not ask for clarification. I did not protest. I did not remind him of the years we had shared, or the countless evenings I had stood by his side. Instead, I let the words echo inside me, and in their echo I felt something inside me break. But it was not a loud break, not the sound of shattering glass. It was quieter, like the soft crack of ice splitting beneath a heavy boot, the kind of fracture that you only recognize fully when you're already sinking. He thought that by excluding me from this gala, by taking someone else, he was pushing me into invisibility, that I would sit at home wounded and humiliated, clutching at my pride as he paraded another woman on his arm. What he did not realize was that silence is never weakness. Sometimes silence is where strength gathers itself, where decisions are made that no scream could ever hold. I watched as he left, the scent of his cologne lingering long after the door closed, the faint trace of his presence woven into the night air. I could already imagine the scene he was staging for himself, the flashing lights outside the luxury venue, the cameras, the glances of approval from his colleagues and acquaintances, the laughter of a woman who thought she had stolen something that was never hers to begin with. It wasn't just betrayal. It was humiliation calculated with precision. He wanted me to feel small, to believe that I had been outshined, outclassed, and discarded. And perhaps, for a flicker of a moment, he succeeded. Because as I sat there, staring into the mirror at the reflection of a woman who had given more than half her life to building with him, I felt the weight of years pressing down, the weight of sacrifices made, of choices bent around his ambitions. But beneath that crushing heaviness, something else began to stir. I remembered the early years when we had nothing, when the two of us had walked into borrowed spaces, smiling politely at gatherings where no one cared if we were present. I remembered holding his hand and telling him that one day we would stand at the center of it all, not as guests, but as hosts. I remembered the first brick we laid, the long hours of work that had shaped what he now took for granted, and I realized with a cold precision that his words, his attempt to erase me from his world of appearances, were founded on ignorance. He had forgotten the source of the ground beneath his feet. He thought he was climbing into a world that belonged to him, but he never realized that the very walls he admired were ones I had built. So I did not cry. I did not crumble. I sat back in that chair and let his words loop in my mind, and the more they echoed, the less they hurt, until they began to feel like something else entirely. A challenge, an opening, the very trigger I had been waiting for. Because while he thought I would be humiliated by absence, he had no idea that my presence had already been written into the very fabric of that night. He had no idea that the venue whose chandeliers he would marvel at, whose golden drapes he would use as the backdrop for his little theater of infidelity, carried my name at the heart of its deeds and documents. He thought he was stepping into a palace that belonged to the powerful, when in truth, he was stepping onto my stage. I smiled then, though no one saw it. It wasn't the smile of someone defeated, but the smile of someone who had seen the first move of a game unfold exactly as expected. He believed he was in control, that by choosing another woman to accompany him, he had stripped me of power, but in his arrogance, he had revealed his greatest weakness. He underestimated me, and that, more than any betrayal, was unforgivable. I poured myself a glass of wine, not to drown my sorrows, but to savor the anticipation, and as the liquid touched my lips, I made a quiet promise to myself. The night he thought would crown his ego would instead be the night he was unmasked. From that moment on, his sentence no longer hurt. It became my weapon. You wouldn't fit in here. he had said. And he was right, in a way. I would not fit into the shallow, performative image he wanted to display, because I was never meant to be a decoration on his arm. I was meant to stand above it all, not as a guest, not as an accessory, but as the owner. And when the host of the evening raised their voice to call my name, when the lights and eyes turned to me, it would be his smile that cracked, his pride that shattered, his world that fell silent. What he believed was my exclusion was nothing but the beginning of his downfall, and as I sat there in the quiet of my room, I knew that the story had already begun to write itself, and it would not be mine that ended in humiliation. It would be his. The words he had thrown at me still lingered like smoke after a fire, the kind that clings to curtains and clothes long after the flames are gone. You wouldn't fit in here. That phrase became the haunting refrain of the evening, but the more it replayed in my head, the more it summoned memories I had not allowed myself to revisit in years. Memories of everything I had given, everything I had bent, everything I had silenced within myself in order to mold a life that he could wear proudly, as though it had been tailored for him alone. When we first met, he was a man full of ideas and ambition, but utterly void of means. I was the one who stayed awake at night, sketching business models on napkins, drafting proposals that bore his name, smoothing the rough edges of his temper when investors doubted him. I was the one who believed in him when belief seemed foolish, who poured not just money, but time, patience, and energy into transforming a dream into a reality. Together, we climbed from obscurity to prominence, and yet somewhere along the way, he began to believe that the climb had been his alone. I can still see the tiny apartment where it all began, its peeling wallpaper, its cramped kitchen with tiles that never came clean no matter how hard I scrubbed. I remember cooking dinners on nights when we could barely afford groceries, making a celebration out of cheap wine and candlelight, assuring him that someday these small sacrifices would be worth it. And they were. But now, as he tightened his tie and dismissed me with that cruel sentence, I realized how easily a decade of devotion could be dismissed by someone whose ego had swollen larger than the life we had built. The injustice of it settled on me like a leaden weight. I had been his partner in every sense of the word, but suddenly I was reduced to an inconvenience, a shadow to be kept away from the glow of his new performance. He wanted to step into that gala with someone who sparkled superficially, someone who would flatter his vanity and draw admiring glances, someone who required none of the heavy lifting I had done for years. It was not just a betrayal of fidelity, it was a betrayal of history. He was erasing me in real time, writing me out of the story that I had helped compose, trying to substitute me with a stranger as though the chapters we had lived together had no weight. I imagined the way he would introduce her, his arm draped confidently around her, his laughter louder than usual as he soaked in the approval of others. To him, this was triumph. To me, it was theft. The theft of years, of sacrifices, of dreams that had been mine as much as his. And yet, as the memories kept surfacing, I began to recognize something else beneath the bitterness. Those years were not wasted, not truly. They had forged me into someone he no longer recognized. He thought he could humiliate me by excluding me, but he had forgotten that the foundation of our success was mine as much as his. He had grown complacent, careless, too drunk on his own reflection to notice that the woman he dismissed was not powerless. I had not only been the architect of his success, but also the guardian of my own. The papers, the contracts, the investments, we had once signed them together, but in his arrogance he had stopped reading the fine print. I never had. It struck me then, with a kind of bitter irony, that while he was rehearsing his charade of grandeur, I was the one who had the keys to the empire he pretended to rule. The venue he considered his stage was, in fact, my design, my ownership, my victory carved from the very years he believed could be so easily erased. He thought he had silenced me by leaving me behind, but he had only granted me the perfect vantage point from which to strike. All those years of sacrifice, of patience, of work behind the scenes, they had not disappeared. They had crystallized into leverage, into quiet power, into the kind of strength that does not need to announce itself until the moment is right. I poured another glass of wine and let the memories keep coming, each one sharpening my resolve rather than breaking me. I remembered late nights filled with exhaustion, where I balanced his failures with my determination, where I lent him my calm when his temper threatened to destroy everything we had worked for. I remembered drafting legal frameworks, learning the language of contracts so that we could protect ourselves, while he focused on appearances and charm. I remembered being overlooked in boardrooms, my suggestions attributed to him, my voice drowned out while he basked in borrowed praise. And I remembered staying silent, not because I was weak, but because I understood that silence could be tactical. Now, as he paraded into that gala with a mistress dressed in silk, it was my silence that would undo him. He had taken for granted that the story of our lives belonged to him, that the narrative was his to edit, his to control, his to perform. But the truth was that the years of effort had not vanished into nothingness. They lived in the deeds signed under my name, in the accounts I had managed, in the strategies I had safeguarded. They lived in the venue where he would soon stand, smiling in ignorance, never realizing that the very ground beneath him bore my signature. The weight of those years was not one of wasted sacrifice. It was the weight of a weapon, and I was done pretending that I did not know how to wield it. As I leaned back in my chair, a strange calm settled over me. The anger that had once threatened to suffocate me gave way to something sharper, something clearer. He thought the gala would be his victory, the night he humiliated me into silence. But it would be his undoing. And when the lights rose, when the host called my name, when the crowd turned to look at me, it would not be the years of effort erased. It would be his illusion of supremacy, his carefully crafted mask, and his mistress's shallow smile. They would crumble all at once, leaving him naked before the truth. The phrase he had used, "You wouldn't fit in here," kept circling in my mind, but now it no longer stung. He was right, in a way. I did not fit in the small role he wanted to confine me to. I did not fit in the shadow he tried to cast over me. I belonged somewhere far higher, not as a discarded wife or forgotten partner, but as the owner, the architect, the woman whose years of sacrifice had built the very stage upon which he thought he could mock me. And when the time came, it would be his own words that sealed his downfall, a downfall written by the same years he thought he had erased, but that had, all along, belonged to me. The shadow of her presence had already seeped into the edges of my thoughts, long before I saw her face. There had been whispers, subtle shifts in his behavior, the way he adjusted his tone when his phone lit up after midnight, the fleeting glances in the mirror as though he were not just preparing for the day, but for someone else's gaze. At first, I dismissed these signs as paranoia, the natural cracks of a marriage weathered by years of shared responsibility and unspoken resentments. But deep inside, I knew that shadows do not form without a source of light. He was careless enough to believe he could hide her, reckless enough to assume I would never see her silhouette traced across his absence. And yet, when the moment came, when he finally emerged with her on his arm, as though she were a jewel freshly discovered, it was not shock that I felt. It was confirmation, a slow, suffocating confirmation of what I had already known. She was everything he thought he wanted the world to see at his side, young enough to appear unspoiled, polished enough to glitter under the chandeliers, shallow enough to laugh at his jokes with the exact pitch of flattery he craved. She wore her ambition like perfume, subtle but intoxicating, and I could imagine the way she must have leaned into him, whispering her little promises of escape from the mundanity of real life. To her, he was not the flawed, impatient man I had endured through years of failure and frustration. He was the polished version he saved for outsiders, the man who could drape himself in charm and wear arrogance as though it were elegance. She saw the mask and mistook it for the man. That was the mistake of the other woman, not realizing that what glitters most on the surface often hides the deepest rot beneath. But as much as she played her role in this performance, she was not the true antagonist. She was a prop in his theater, a willing participant in his attempt to erase me, a convenient body to fill the empty space where he thought I no longer belonged. The betrayal was not just the existence of her. It was the calculation behind her introduction. He had chosen this gala, this night, this crowd, as the stage for my humiliation. He wanted the whispers to spread, wanted people to notice the absence of the wife who had built the foundation of his success, and the presence of the mistress who was meant to symbolize his triumph. It was not intimacy he sought with her. It was spectacle, and the cruelty of it was deliberate. He wanted me to hear about it, to to feel it, to be diminished by the echo of their laughter against the marble walls of the venue I had claimed long before either of them stepped foot inside. I pictured the way he must have guided her through the doors, his hand pressed firmly against the small of her back, his voice lowered to that tone of pride he used when showing off something he believed belonged to him. I could imagine the way she smiled up at him, believing she had been chosen, believing she had won, when in truth she was only a pawn on a board she could not even see. They thought they were shining in the spotlight together, but in reality, they were already standing on a trap door, one that I had built with meticulous patience. The injustice of it still burned, not because of her, but because of what she represented, the embodiment of every dismissal, every belittling comment, every sacrifice I had made, that he had decided could be replaced by something younger, shinier, more compliant. She was not my rival. She was my mirror, reflecting the way he saw women as adornments, as accessories to his ego. To him, I had been useful until I became inconvenient. To her, he was valuable until he became insufficient. Their alliance was not built on love or loyalty. It was built on illusion, and illusions always collapse under the weight of reality. And so I did not waste my energy on hatred for her. Hatred was too heavy, too consuming, and I needed clarity. What I felt instead was an almost clinical detachment, the kind one feels when watching a tragedy play out on stage while already knowing the ending. She thought she had stepped into a story of passion and conquest, but what she had actually stepped into was the middle of my carefully constructed narrative of retribution. I did not need to confront her directly, nor did I need to scream my truth into the faces of those who would not care to hear it. All I needed was to wait, to let the night unfold until the moment came when the lights would shift and the applause would rise. Not for him, not for her, but for me. As I sat alone in the quiet of my home, I thought about how strange it was that betrayal could breed not despair, but lucidity. His choice to bring her into that space was not just a wound, it was a revelation. He revealed to me his vanity, his arrogance, his blindness to the reality that the very venue he used as a stage for his triumph was mine. He had pulled the curtain back on his own ignorance, and she, poor shadow that she was, followed him into the glare without knowing the fire she was walking into. In the end, she would fade, as all shadows do when the true source of light reveals itself. For now, she lingered in the background of my thoughts, an emblem of his betrayal, a reminder of his hubris, but nothing more, because the real story was not about her, or even about him. It was about me, about the years I had built, about the power I had hidden, about the moment when silence would turn into revelation. And when that moment arrived, when the host called my name and the room erupted into recognition, her shadow would scatter, and he would stand alone in the ruins of his own spectacle. There is a particular kind of silence that society expects from women like me, a silence wrapped in dignity, in composure, in the unspoken understanding that betrayal must be swallowed with a smile, that humiliation must be endured in private so as not to disturb the performance of the man. I had abided by that silence for years, not because I lacked a voice, but because I believed that timing was everything, that to speak too soon was to weaken the impact of the truth. But that night, as I sat alone with the echo of his words circling me, "You wouldn't fit in here," I realized that the silence he expected was no longer the silence I was willing to give. For the first time, I saw my restraint not as endurance, but as complicity, and the realization unsettled me. I had given him the benefit of my quiet patience. I had allowed him to believe in his illusion of control, but it was time to shatter that illusion with the very thing he underestimated: my capacity to plan, to act, to strike without warning. I thought of the countless women before me who had been written out of their own stories, erased by men who believed themselves untouchable, dismissed as though years of sacrifice and labor could be swept away by the glint of a younger smile or the sway of a glittering gown. I thought of the wives who sat at home, their anger dissolving into bitterness, their pain turned inward until it became part of their identity, and I knew with certainty that I would not join them. I would not be another silent casualty in the endless cycle of men devouring women's lives and moving on unscathed. I had too much at stake, too much truth carved into the very bones of the empire he flaunted, too much strength accumulated from the years he believed he was the only one climbing. So I decided, with the same cold precision I once used to draft contracts and negotiate deals, that I would not be the silent wife. I would be the storm he never saw coming, the reckoning he thought impossible. But this would not be the reckless fury he might expect. No, my vengeance would not come in screaming matches or broken plates. That was the chaos of the powerless, and I was not powerless. My revenge would be measured, deliberate, elegant, the kind of justice that unfolds not with a bang, but with the slow, devastating inevitability of an avalanche. He had mistaken my quiet for fragility, but in truth, my quiet had always been the sound of strategies forming. I remember staring at my reflection that night, not as a woman broken, not as a wife discarded, but as a force gathering itself. My face was calm, my eyes steady, but inside me something ancient stirred. It was the part of me that had endured sleepless nights drafting proposals while he dreamed, the part of me that had carried the burden of our debts on my shoulders while he played the visionary, the part of me that had smiled politely in boardrooms while men ignored my voice and applauded his. That part of me had grown accustomed to swallowing pride for the sake of progress, but now it demanded release. It demanded justice. And justice, I knew, would come in the form of exposure. Not loud, messy exposure, but the kind that burns quietly and leaves nothing standing. The decision was liberating, almost intoxicating. The weight of his betrayal no longer pressed against me as a wound. It became fuel. Every memory of sacrifice, every slight, every whispered insult or dismissive glance transformed into resolve. I thought about the mistress he paraded at his side, how she glowed in borrowed light, how he looked at her as though she were his prize, and I almost pitied her. She had no idea that she was standing at the center of a carefully laid trap, a pawn in a game whose rules she did not know. My vengeance was not aimed at her. She was a symptom, not the disease. The disease was his arrogance, his belief that I would fade quietly into the background while he remade his story without me. And it was that arrogance that would destroy him. From that moment on, my mind shifted into a kind of clarity I had not felt in years. I began to trace the outline of what was to come, not with anger, but with the same meticulous attention to detail that had once built our empire. I thought about the venue, about the stage he thought was his triumph, and I smiled at the irony of it. That space was mine in every legal and financial sense, and yet he walked into it as though it were a kingdom bestowed upon him by destiny. He would learn soon enough that destiny had little to do with it. He was not walking into his coronation. He was walking into his trial, and I would be both witness and judge. The more I allowed this plan to form, the calmer I became. There was no need for haste, no need for impulsive outbursts. Every second he believed he was winning only deepened the impact of his eventual fall. He would laugh, he would drink, he would present her as his prize, and all the while, the walls themselves would conspire against him, waiting for the moment when the truth would be unveiled. I imagined the host clearing their throat, the crowd quieting, the announcement ringing out with my name attached to it, and I saw his face falter, the blood drain from his skin, the mistress at his side shrinking into irrelevance. That moment would be worth every wound, every sacrifice, every silence I had endured until now. And so I chose. I chose to abandon the role of the silent wife, the overlooked partner, the erased architect of his success. I chose to step into the role of strategist, of avenger, of the woman who would no longer endure humiliation in the shadows. He had forced me into invisibility, but invisibility had always been my power. He thought he had silenced me, but all he had done was sharpen my voice. The decision was made. I would no longer watch him rewrite our story. I would write the ending myself, and it would not be the ending he expected. Secrets have a way of breathing in the quiet spaces of our lives, existing not as lies, but as truths withheld, truths too powerful to be wasted on those who would not understand them. My husband had always assumed he knew every part of me, that because I had built my days around his needs and my nights around his ambitions, there was no room in me for shadows or private victories. He mistook devotion for transparency, forgetting that even the most loyal heart reserves corners untouched, reserves strengths that wait for the right moment to rise. And so he walked into that gala as if he were untouchable, his mistress on his arm, his arrogance swelling with every step, not realizing that the ground beneath him was mine, that the chandeliers reflecting in her eyes belonged to me, that the very name etched into the deeds of the venue he paraded himself in was the one he had just dismissed with cruelty. It had begun years ago, quietly, when we were still clawing our way out of obscurity. I had insisted on investments that he dismissed as excessive, acquisitions that he considered vanity projects. The venue was one of them. He had laughed when I told him it was not only a luxury hall, but a fortress of possibility, a symbol of permanence in a world obsessed with appearances. He had rolled his eyes at the paperwork, signed his name without reading the fine print, assuming I was indulging myself in some expensive whim. He never knew that I had secured it under my name alone, that I had woven the ownership into a web of contracts so intricate that even if he tried to unravel them now, he would find only my signature at every junction. To him, it was another piece of furniture in the empire he thought belonged solely to him. To me, it was a safeguard, an anchor, the silent insurance against the day when I might need proof that my years of effort were not illusions. That day had come, and he was too blind to see it. The secret was not just the ownership of the venue. It was the knowledge that I had never been the silent shadow he believed me to be. I had always been calculating, always watching, always anticipating the possibility that the man I loved could one day turn into the man who betrayed me. I had not wanted to believe it, but experience had taught me that power corrupts slowly, like water carving grooves into stone, and I had protected myself accordingly. While he had been busy chasing admiration, I had been busy safeguarding the reality beneath the illusions. He lived in appearances. I lived in foundations. He did not know the difference until now, and by the time he learned, it would be too late. I could almost picture him in that moment, striding through the grand entrance with her on his arm, basking in the glow of attention. He thought the secret he carried, the affair, the betrayal, was the one that would define the night. He thought he had orchestrated the ultimate humiliation for me, but my secret was larger, heavier, undeniable. It did not need whispers or photographs or late-night suspicions to prove itself. It existed in ink, in law, in the unshakable weight of ownership. When the host of the evening raised their voice and called for the woman who owned the walls they stood in, it would not be his secret that mattered. It would be mine. I had often wondered, in the sleepless hours when doubt crept close, whether keeping this from him had been an act of cruelty or of survival. Perhaps it was both. He had always wanted to be the face of our success, the one whose hand shook others in public, whose voice carried authority in meetings, and I had allowed it, because it cost me nothing to let him believe the illusion. But what he never understood was that while faces fade and voices are silenced, signatures endure. I had given him the spotlight, but I had kept the pen. That was my secret. That was my insurance. And that was the reason why, on the night he thought he had destroyed me, I would rise from the silence he believed was weakness and reveal the truth that would burn his facade to ashes. The beauty of a secret like mine was its patience. It did not demand to be revealed immediately. It did not gnaw at me like guilt or itch like temptation. It waited, silent and steady, until the moment when revelation would not just wound but devastate. And as I sat there, picturing his smug expression, her delicate hand clinging to his arm, the crowd around them dazzled by the surface of their spectacle, I realized how poetic it was. He believed he had all the control, when in truth, every step he took in that venue only tightened the noose of my secret around his pride. I had once loved him enough to protect him from the consequences of his arrogance. I had once believed that shielding him from the truth was a form of loyalty. But love does not survive betrayal intact. It transforms, reshapes itself, hardens into something unrecognizable. And in me, love had turned into resolve. My secret had once been a gift, the quiet assurance that our empire could weather storms, because it rested on more than his fragile ego. Now, it was a blade, and he had walked directly into its edge without even knowing it. What he would learn that night, what she would learn by his side, and what every guest in that glittering hall would witness, was that power does not always announce itself with grandeur. Sometimes power waits quietly, hidden behind a smile, folded into a contract. tucked away in the patient silence of a woman underestimated. And when it finally reveals itself, it does not simply correct an injustice, it demolishes it. That was the secret he never knew. That was the truth he had mocked, ignored, dismissed. And that was the truth that would rise in the most public, undeniable way, leaving him stripped of everything he thought he controlled. He believed I would not fit in at the gala, that my absence would be my humiliation. But what he failed to realize was that I was not absent. I had been there all along, in every beam, every marble step, every glittering chandelier. And when my name was spoken, it would not be as a guest, not as a wife, not even as a scorned woman. It would be as the owner. His secret had been a mistress. Mine had been an empire. There is an art to patience that only those who have suffered in silence truly master, and I had spent years perfecting it. While he chased applause and admiration, I had watched quietly, storing every detail, every pattern, every weakness. Now, with the gala approaching, and his betrayal unveiled in its most flamboyant form, patience became my sharpest weapon. I knew that if I rushed, if I struck too soon, I would rob myself of the devastating precision that would make his fall complete. So I waited, and in my waiting, I prepared. The stage for his undoing was not something I needed to build. It already existed, already belonged to me. All I needed was to arrange the pieces, to let them align in such a way that his arrogance would become the very rope that dragged him into the abyss. The first step was invisibility. He thought I was humiliated at home, cast aside, licking my wounds in the shadows. That was precisely what I wanted him to think. The power of being underestimated is that it blinds the enemy to your movements. He did not ask questions when I left the house at odd hours, did not notice the calls I made or the messages I sent, because in his mind I was irrelevant, a discarded wife with no part to play in his carefully curated performance. He forgot that irrelevance is a mask, and behind mine, I was speaking to the staff of the venue, ensuring that they knew who signed their paychecks, who held their loyalty, who owned the very ground he would boast upon. Every glass poured, every light dimmed, every note of music played. It would all be executed under my silent authority. He would be surrounded by my reach, even as he believed himself to be in control. Then came the matter of witnesses. I knew that private revenge would not be enough. For years, he had humiliated me in subtle ways, in cutting comments only I could hear, in dismissive gestures that the world mistook for charm. If his betrayal had been quiet, perhaps I would have chosen silence in return, but he had chosen spectacle. He had brought his mistress to a place meant for grandeur, paraded her through halls designed to impress, and aimed the dagger of humiliation not only at me, but at my very existence. So his exposure had to be just as public, just as undeniable. I made sure that the guest list included faces who mattered, business partners, acquaintances whose opinions he craved, even family members who had long since been conditioned to view him as the golden figure of success. They would be there to watch his downfall, not in whispers, but in stunned silence, not in gossip, but in the undeniable truth of the host's announcement. The staff moved with precision under my instructions. They were careful not to betray my involvement, careful to keep the illusion intact. I wanted him to believe the night was his, that every glittering detail was a tribute to his triumph. I wanted his mistress to preen under the chandelier lights, to smile into the admiring eyes of strangers, to believe she had taken what was mine. The higher their confidence rose, the harder the fall would crush them. It was a delicate balance, allowing the performance to unfold without interruption, all while knowing that the climax had already been written and that I was the author. And yet, beneath the cold calculation, there was a storm within me. Preparing the stage was not merely logistical, it was emotional. Every detail reminded me of the years I had spent building alongside him, of the nights I had drafted contracts while he dreamed of grandeur, of the days I had balanced accounts while he rehearsed his charm. The venue itself had been my dream once, a testament to permanence, to the belief that we were building something together that would outlast us both. Now it had become my weapon, and that transformation carried a bitterness that even victory could not fully erase. But bitterness is not weakness. It is clarity, sharpened and distilled. It kept me focused when sorrow threatened to pull me under. It reminded me why this moment mattered, why I could not afford mercy. I rehearsed the scene in my mind endlessly, not because I feared it would falter, but because anticipation is its own kind of intoxication. I saw him laughing, his hand resting possessively on her back, his pride swelling with each approving glance. I saw the way he would stand taller, his smile fixed in the belief that he had triumphed over me, that I was reduced to silence. And then I saw the moment when the host, smiling warmly, would raise the microphone and speak my name. I imagined the hush falling over the crowd, the collective turn of heads, the ripple of realization spreading through the hall. I imagined his face, the way his smile would freeze, the way his mistress would falter, the way silence would swallow them whole. That vision was what fueled me, what steadied my hand as I prepared the invisible threads that would tighten around him. I did not need confrontation. I did not need to scream, or argue, or prove myself with words. The beauty of my revenge was that it required nothing but presence. My name alone, attached to the venue he thought was his theater of triumph, would undo him. His betrayal had been a choice of arrogance over loyalty, of illusion over truth, and so it was only fitting that his downfall would come from the same stage he had chosen to exalt himself. My secret ownership was no longer a safeguard. It was the blade waiting at the climax of his performance. The stage was ready. The players were in position. The staff knew their roles. The guests would provide the audience. The host would deliver the line that would ignite the collapse. And I, the woman he had tried to erase, would step into the light not as a scorned wife, not as a humiliated victim, but as the silent architect of his ruin. Every detail had been prepared with care, every possibility accounted for, and all that remained now was time. He thought he was building a night of victory. What he did not know was that he was walking directly into a trap designed not just to expose him, but to unmake him entirely. And so I waited, patient and poised, as the hours dwindled and the moment drew near. The stage was set, and I had prepared it with all the precision of a woman who has lived too long in silence. Soon, the silence would break, not with my scream, but with my name, echoing in the hall he believed was his crown. And when that moment came, the strike would not just wound him, it would end him. The night arrived draped in gold and expectation, the kind of evening that seemed designed to shimmer in photographs, to live forever in the curated memories of those desperate to prove their importance. From the outside, the venue stood radiant, a beacon of opulence with its towering arches and crystal chandeliers that spilled their light into the night like cascades of frozen fire. Cars lined the entrance, one after another, each releasing its finely dressed passengers who were eager to step into the world of elegance and excess. I had orchestrated it all, and yet to the crowd, it appeared as though the night belonged to him, to the man who strutted in with his mistress at his side, believing the world was his stage. They didn't see the strings, the quiet command behind every detail, the invisible hand that had shaped the evening. But I did. I saw everything. He arrived exactly as I imagined, his arm hooked around hers, his chest puffed with pride, his smile stretched too wide, a mask so carefully plastered onto his face that I wondered if even he believed in it anymore. She glowed beneath the chandeliers, her dress cut to perfection, her eyes darting to every approving glance, drinking in the validation she thought she had stolen from me. She tilted her head toward him, laughed at his words before he even finished speaking, touched his sleeve with the rehearsed intimacy of someone desperate to prove ownership. They were a pair of actors stepping into a play they thought they had written, unaware that the script had been revised long before the curtain rose. The hall was alive with sound, clinking glasses, murmured greetings, bursts of laughter that rang too loudly in the vaulted ceilings. The air carried the scent of perfume and polished silver, of champagne poured endlessly into delicate flutes. It was everything he wanted, the admiration of strangers, the illusion of triumph, the feeling of superiority he craved like oxygen. He basked in it, parading her through the room, shaking hands, leaning in to whisper as though he belonged to the upper echelons he had always envied. He believed he was winning, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to watch the performance with the detachment of an observer. It was almost beautiful, in its fragility. The higher he climbed in those hours of glitter and applause, the further he would fall when the truth was spoken. I moved silently among the guests, unseen by him though I was everywhere. The staff glanced at me with subtle acknowledgement, their loyalty unspoken but undeniable. They knew, as I knew, who the evening truly belonged to. Every toast, every spotlight, every note of music was a thread in the tapestry I had woven. I felt a strange calm settle over me, a serenity that comes when destiny aligns with patience. This was not rage anymore. It was inevitability. He had thought humiliation would be mine, but humiliation only sticks when it finds fertile ground. And I had prepared the soil of this night too carefully for it to grow anywhere but beneath his own feet. I studied the way people looked at them, curiosity, admiration, sometimes envy, and I realized how shallow those gazes were, how easy it was to manipulate perception. They saw a man flaunting his conquest, a woman glowing in his shadow, and they believed it was power. They did not see the rot beneath, the arrogance that blinded him, the ignorance that kept him from realizing he was celebrating within a cage of his own making. I wondered how many of them would gasp when my name was called, how many would replay their conversations with him in their minds and recognize the irony. The thought did not comfort me. It exhilarated me. The mistress, for her part, played her role perfectly. She leaned into him, eyes sparkling, lips curved into the kind of smile that could convince the naive she was in love. But I saw the truth in her every gesture. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the room. She wanted to be seen, to be envied, to be validated. He was simply her vessel, the man she used to climb into the limelight. And I almost pitied her for not realizing that the light she craved was about to turn harsh, exposing her for what she truly was, a participant in someone else's humiliation, an actress trapped in a play that would end with her applause turned into whispers of shame. The night carried on, the music swelling, the champagne flowing, his laughter echoing louder each time he circled the room. He thought I was nowhere, that I was diminished into silence. But the irony was delicious. I was everywhere, watching, orchestrating, waiting. And as I stood there, poised in the wings of the stage he thought was his, I realized that humiliation is not about the act itself, but about the audience. He had chosen his stage carefully, thinking this was his grand triumph, but what he did not know was that the true performance had yet to begin, and when it did, every eye in the room would bear witness not to my shame, but to his collapse. I let the night build, let the music swell, let the arrogance in him bloom to its fullest. It was like watching a balloon inflate, fragile and bright, stretching thinner and thinner under the pressure of its own air. I did not need to lift a finger. I simply had to wait for the inevitable moment when the host would take the stage, clear their throat, and call for the true owner of the venue. That moment was coming, closer with each toast, with each laugh, with each careless glance he gave to the woman at his side. He believed the humiliation had been sealed, that he had written me out of the story. What he never understood was that the story had always been mine, and tonight, I was the one holding the pen. The glitter of the gala was intoxicating for him, a stage drenched in gold and illusion. But for me, it was something else entirely. It was the theater of his humiliation, the place where his arrogance would finally meet its reckoning, the night where silence would turn into thunder. And as the evening reached its crescendo, I felt the anticipation hum through me like electricity. Soon, very soon, the performance would end, and the truth would break open like glass underfoot. The air shifted at the exact moment the host ascended the small platform at the front of the hall, the glittering crowd instinctively falling into silence as the microphone hummed to life. There was a hush, not the awkward stillness of anticipation, but the kind that carries weight, like the intake of breath before a storm breaks. I had been waiting for this, every second of the night winding toward this point, every smile, every toast, every ripple of laughter from his lips bringing us closer to the edge. He stood there among the guests, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back, his confidence radiating like heat, his mistress gazing up at him as though he were her ticket into eternity. He didn't know it yet, but he was standing on the precipice, and the ground beneath him was already crumbling. The host spoke warmly, their voice carrying over the crowd with practiced authority, thanking the attendees for their presence, for their contributions to the charities celebrated that evening, weaving through the formalities that gave the night its veneer of purpose. I watched him beam, the way his smile widened with each word, certain that this was the stage he had claimed for himself, that the applause belonged in part to him, that his presence with her at his side had cemented his dominance. The mistress glowed in that reflected pride, preening beneath the chandeliers as though the light had chosen her. They were the perfect picture of vanity, until the words that would unravel everything slipped seamlessly into the air. "And now," the host said, smiling as they glanced toward the crowd, "it is my honor to introduce to you the true force behind this evening, the woman whose vision and ownership have made this event, and indeed this entire venue, possible. Please join me in welcoming—" And then came my name, my full name, spoken clearly, echoed through the speakers, scattering across the marble floors and gilded walls, with a resonance that made my heart pound, not with fear, but with vindication. The reaction was instant, a ripple moving through the guests as heads turned, eyes widened, murmurs flickered from one to another like sparks catching on dry wood. For a moment, the entire hall seemed to hold its breath, and then all those eyes turned toward me, drawn as though by gravity, as I stepped forward. I had chosen my appearance carefully, not ostentatious, not desperate for attention, but deliberate, composed, undeniable. I moved through the crowd with the steady calm of someone who belongs, because I did belong, more than any of them could have imagined. My heels clicked against the marble, the sound cutting through the silence like a drum beat, steady and inevitable. I saw his face before anything else. The smile that had stretched so easily across his lips froze in place, faltered, and then cracked, his expression sliding from pride into disbelief. His mistress blinked rapidly, confusion darkening into panic, her grip on his arm tightening as though she could anchor herself in his crumbling confidence. He tried to mask it, tried to recover, but the blood had drained from his cheeks, and his eyes betrayed him. In that instant, he understood, or at least began to understand, that the night was not his, that the stage he thought he had conquered was mine, and that the humiliation he had crafted so carefully had turned inward, poised now to consume him. The applause rose slowly at first, tentative claps building into a wave of acknowledgement, filling the hall with a sound that was both celebration and revelation. I accepted it with a small nod, my face calm, my smile serene, though inside I felt a storm breaking free. Years of silence, of patience, of sacrifices erased and belittled, all of it found its answer in that applause. It wasn't just the recognition of ownership. It was the recognition of truth, of authority, of the fact that I had not only survived his betrayal but stood above it, commanding the very space he thought he ruled. I reached the stage and stood beside the host, my eyes briefly sweeping the crowd before inevitably finding his again. His mistress had turned pale, her smile faltering as she whispered something hurriedly into his ear, but he couldn't respond. He was frozen, trapped in the weight of realization. Every guest in that room had seen the shift, had watched as the man who arrived full of arrogance and triumph was reduced to a shadow beneath the light of my name. The narrative had flipped in an instant, and no amount of charm or pretense could undo it. As the host handed me the microphone, I felt the weight of every moment that had led me here, every night spent building in silence, every wound inflicted by his arrogance. My voice was steady, my words chosen not to lash out but to affirm. I spoke of gratitude, of the honor of creating a space where people could gather, of the importance of resilience and vision. I did not mention him, nor her. I did not need to. Their humiliation was written in their faces, in the silence that clung to them while the room erupted around me. The more I spoke, the clearer it became that this night was not theirs, had never been theirs. It was mine, and the revelation was absolute. When I finished, the applause rose again, louder, more insistent, echoing against the walls with a force that left no room for doubt. I handed the microphone back to the host, stepped down from the stage, and walked through the crowd as though I were gliding, every step a declaration, every glance a reminder of the truth. People leaned in to congratulate me, to shake my hand, to smile with genuine admiration, but all I saw was him, standing stiff and silent, his mistress shrinking beside him, both caught in the spotlight of exposure they had not anticipated. The announcement had changed everything. It had rewritten the script of the evening, torn apart the illusion he had tried to build. and placed me where I had always belonged, at the center, not as his accessory, but as the architect, the owner, the force that could no longer be denied. And as I returned to my place among the guests, my heart steady, my resolve stronger than ever, I knew the Gala was no longer his theater of triumph. It was his stage of ruin. There are moments in life when time seems to betray its own rhythm, when every second stretches thin as glass, fragile and sharp, capturing within it every detail with excruciating clarity. That was the moment he realized that the mask he had so carefully worn, the mask he believed impenetrable, had been ripped away in front of everyone. I watched the collapse of his composure not as a sudden fall, but as a slow, unraveling descent, each thread of his pride snapping one after another. He tried to hold himself upright, to summon that same practiced smile he had used for years to charm and deceive. But the weight of exposure pressed against him until his posture faltered. His eyes darted restlessly, and his words, those endless words he always used to dominate rooms, abandoned him. The mistress beside him shifted uneasily, her once confident glow fading into the pale shimmer of embarrassment. Her hand, which had clung so proudly to his arm, now seemed hesitant, unsure if it still had a place there. She whispered, frantic, her lips moving quickly against his ear, but he gave no answer. His silence was louder than any declaration he could have made. The crowd saw it, felt it. In their glances, in the murmurs that floated like static through the air, his humiliation became a shared spectacle. It was no longer between him and me. It was communal, undeniable, woven into the collective memory of every person present. I could sense the shift in the room. Where moments before there had been admiration, even envy, there was now distance, the subtle retreat of people unwilling to be tethered to a sinking man. Guests who had smiled at him earlier now avoided his gaze, turning instead to greet me, their hands reaching for mine, their compliments flowing easily, as though they had always known where the true power resided. He had not only lost control of the night, he had lost the narrative of who he was in their eyes. The carefully curated image of a man ascending, untouchable, admired, now reduced to nothing more than a fool caught in his own trap. The fall was not dramatic, not a single act of collapse, but a series of small defeats that compounded until he stood surrounded by the ruins of his pretense. A laugh that died in his throat when no one joined in, a gesture toward a guest ignored with polite coldness. The mistress slipping slightly away from his side as though distance might preserve her from sharing his shame. The more he tried to salvage his dignity, the more it slipped through his fingers. And I, calm and deliberate, needed only to watch. His undoing required no intervention from me. The truth had already done its work, and arrogance, once pierced, devours itself faster than any external blade. I remembered, as I watched him stumble in silence, the countless times he had dismissed me with that same arrogant confidence, the way he had reduced my sacrifices to footnotes, the way he had believed I was too dependent, too loyal, too quiet to ever threaten his supremacy. How many dinners had he silenced me with a glance? How many meetings had he spoken over me, claiming my words as his own? How many times had he chosen appearances over truth, believing that illusion was all that mattered? And now, illusion had abandoned him. For the first time in his life, he was seen without the mask, and the man beneath was small, fragile, insignificant. His mistress, once radiant, now wilted under the weight of the room's attention. She was not built for humiliation. She had thrived in envy, in being the one admired, the one whispered about. But now the whispers had turned sour. The envy had curdled into disdain. She looked at him with new eyes, not the eyes of desire, but of doubt. She had stepped into this performance believing she was rising alongside him, but the foundation beneath her had collapsed, and in her expression, I saw the dawning realization that she had tied herself to a sinking ship. I did not need to say a word to her. Her own reflection in that gilded hall had already spoken louder than I ever could. And still, he tried, stumbling through the motions of a man clinging to power, forcing laughter, raising his glass, speaking words that fell flat and lifeless. But power, once broken, is not easily reclaimed. His audience had shifted, their attention no longer his to command. They were mine now, drawn to me not only by ownership, but by the undeniable composure I carried as he faltered. I did not need to confront him. Every moment of his collapse was confrontation enough. The more he struggled, the more pathetic he became, the more absolute the fall of the masked man. I felt no triumph in that moment, no gloating sense of victory. What I felt was deeper, steadier, more final. It was justice. Not the chaotic justice of anger, but the inevitable justice of truth revealed. He had built his life on illusions, and illusions cannot survive the light. When the mask falls, there is nothing left to protect the man beneath, and as he stood there, pale and broken, surrounded by whispers and silence, I knew that the man who had once believed he controlled everything was finished. His fall was not loud, not theatrical, but it was complete, and it was in that completeness that I found my peace. He had sought to humiliate me, to write me out of the story, but in the end, he had written himself out. And I, the woman he dismissed, stood not only untouched, but elevated, the truth of my strength finally revealed to all. The applause that had washed over me when my name was called still echoed faintly in the vaulted hall, reverberating in the crystal chandeliers and polished marble, as though the building itself had conspired to bear witness to my reclamation. Yet it was not the sound of hands clapping that stayed with me most. It was the silence that followed him, the silence that wrapped around his figure like a shroud as people pulled away from his orbit, as if contact with him might taint their own reputations. The contrast could not have been sharper. Where I stood surrounded by warmth, congratulations, and recognition, he stood abandoned, a man unmasked in front of the very world he had been so desperate to impress. In that moment, I realized that humiliation was not his only fate. Oblivion was. For years, I had walked in his shadow, accepting the erasures, swallowing the dismissals, believing that sacrifice was the natural duty of a wife. I had kept myself small so that he could feel larger, softened my brilliance so that his dim light could appear to shine. But now, standing before those who once looked through me, I was no longer small, no longer diminished. My rebirth was not loud or flamboyant. It did not come with declarations of vengeance or speeches dripping with bitterness. It was quiet, steady, inevitable, as though it had been waiting for this very night to unfurl. The woman I had once been, the silent partner, the overlooked architect, the wife who endured, had died with the sound of my name echoing across that hall. In her place stood someone unrecognizable to him, a woman who owed him nothing, who had nothing left to prove, who carried herself with the calm authority of one who knows she belongs. I felt it in the way people approached me, their eyes no longer sliding past but locking on to mine, their words tinged with genuine respect. They spoke to me not as his wife, but as myself, acknowledging me as the owner, the force behind the beauty of the venue, the power that had gone unnoticed until now. Their recognition was not merely about the property or the title. It was about presence, about the undeniable truth that I had endured and emerged stronger, that I had faced humiliation designed to erase me and transformed it into the stage of my own ascension. Across the room, I caught sight of his mistress, her expression clouded with the dawning awareness that the man she clung to was no prize at all, but a liability, a man stripped of his illusions, revealed as hollow. She avoided my gaze, shrinking into the background as whispers curled around her like smoke, whispers that would follow her long after this night ended. She had entered this gala believing she had won, but in truth, she had only chained herself to his collapse. My victory did not require her downfall. It required only the exposure of his arrogance, but exposure is rarely gentle, and the fragments of their false triumph now lay scattered at their feet, impossible to piece together. And him. He could not bring himself to meet my eyes. The man who had once stood taller than the room, feeding off its admiration, now bent beneath its weight. I watched him attempt to recover, to salvage dignity with shallow laughter, with gestures that grew weaker each time. But dignity is not something one can claw back once it has been publicly stripped. It must be rebuilt, slowly, through humility and truth, two things he had never possessed. His fall was complete, not because I had pushed him, but because he had built his life on foundations of illusion, and illusions collapse the moment truth walks into the room. As the evening wound on, I remained calm, poised, moving through the crowd with the assurance of someone who had finally been seen. The congratulations felt less like validation and more like acknowledgement of something that had always been true, but hidden beneath years of silence. I was not reborn by their applause. I was reborn by the recognition within myself, the understanding that I no longer needed to shrink, to compromise, to silence my own strength. Rebirth is not the creation of something new, but the uncovering of what has always been waiting beneath. And I had been waiting far too long. When I finally stepped out into the night, the air cool against my skin, I felt lighter than I had in years. The city lights shimmered, the hum of cars and distant music blending into a symphony that seemed to celebrate not just the end of the gala, but the beginning of my life beyond him. He remained inside, trapped in the ruins of his performance, but I walked away free from the years of invisibility, free from the weight of his arrogance, free from the need to justify my worth to anyone but myself. That was the true victory, not his humiliation, though it was satisfying in its inevitability, but my liberation. I had not been destroyed by betrayal. I had been reshaped by it. The night that was meant to be my erasure had become my revelation, and as I moved forward, no longer defined by his shadow, I knew that I had been reborn in public, not as his wife, not as his victim, but as myself, whole, undeniable, and stronger than ever.